For over 100 years, the story of the Titanic seemed set in stone, a tragic tale carved into history, retold in movies, museums, and whispered legends. But in the icy darkness nearly 4,000 meters below the Atlantic, a team of scientists has just changed the script. Using jaw-dropping three-dimensional scanning technology, they have created a complete digital twin of the Titanic's wreck. What they found at those depths shatters what we thought we knew and reveals secrets that turn history upside down. If you thought every Titanic mystery had been solved, think again. Brought Titanic's ghosts back to life. For decades, the Titanic story seemed complete. From documentaries to museum tours, every detail was pored over, at least, so we thought. All the while, the real evidence sat in darkness nearly 4,000 meters below, unseen, untouchable, and out of reach for even the bravest explorers. In 2025, that all changed. Not because someone dived deeper, but because someone finally saw the wreck with new eyes, a digital eye set powered by photogrammetry and relentless curiosity. The mission began as a partnership between deep-sea engineering firms, National Geographic, and Atlantic Productions. Their goal was audacious: map the entire wreck, every rivet and shadow, not just for show, but to answer the mysteries that generations of divers and dreamers had only guessed at. They deployed a small fleet of robotic submersibles, each loaded with multispectral cameras, lasers, and 3D mapping software. The submersibles crisscrossed the site in a methodical grid for weeks, taking over 700,000 photos from every possible angle and collecting 16 terabytes of visual data. This was not just a scan. It was, in the words of one engineer, a resurrection, a way to time travel back to the very night the Titanic vanished. As the first renderings came to light, even the most hardened experts were stunned. The bow, still stately and upright, pointed toward the New York it never reached. Railings bent, portholes gaping, and anchor chains coiled as if waiting for orders. But travel just 600 meters, and you meet the stern, a mangled skeleton, collapsed decks, boilers and engines torn out and flung across the ocean floor. Between the two, a narrow corridor of 5,000 artifacts formed an unmistakable debris trail, like breadcrumbs marking Titanic's final agony. What makes this so powerful? For the first time, you can zoom in on a rivet, see a child's shoe, or read the faded logo on a tea set. More than that, you can trace exactly where each piece landed, giving experts a forensic timeline of the disaster in ways never before possible. The digital model, so precise that you can count the teeth on a gear or spot a scorch mark on wiring, instantly debunked some of the old myths. One of the biggest revelations? The ship's breakup was not the dramatic, one-second snap shown in movies. The scan shows a brutal, drawn-out sequence, steel beams twisting, decks folding in on themselves, machinery hurled hundreds of meters as the stern rotated violently during descent. The bow, by contrast, buried itself gracefully in the mud, as if still reaching for the surface. This explained why the two halves look so different and why personal belongings from the grandest staterooms ended up in the same resting place as a coal trimmer's shovel. With each pass of the submersibles, new details came into focus. There were rooms never seen by cameras before, corridors where melted wiring still clung to the walls, and collapsed bunks with luggage tangled in a net of debris. The precision of this technology allowed researchers to reconstruct where crew and passengers must have stood, what they clung to in their final moments, and how quickly the chaos unfolded. But as extraordinary as these visual discoveries are, they lead to even bigger questions. If the outside of Titanic told a new story, what would a closer look inside, especially in the engine rooms and electrical systems, reveal about the ship's last stand? Was the story of heroism and tragedy even more complex than we realized? With one final sweep of the submersibles, the focus shifted from the ghostly corridors to the real battlefield of Titanic's last hours, the engine room and the brave crew who fought to keep hope alive long after others had given up. If you thought the surface was shocking, wait until you see what the digitals can expose deep below decks. Just as researchers thought they had seen everything. What happened in the engine rooms changed the fate of everyone on board, and finally, the evidence has surfaced. In every retelling of the Titanic's tragic story, the focus has always been above decks. We picture frantic passengers dashing for lifeboats, the band bravely playing as the Atlantic claims the ship, and officers trying to maintain order as chaos builds all around. But what really happened deep below, in the belly of the ship where the heartbeat of the Titanic pulsed with fire and steam? Until recently, much of that story was left to speculation and the occasional footnote. Now, with the advent of groundbreaking three-dimensional scanning technology, those shadows have lifted and what has emerged is a story of almost unimaginable grit and sacrifice. The Titanic was not just a luxury liner. It was a floating power plant, driven by 29 boilers, over 150 furnaces, and some of the largest reciprocating steam engines ever built at the time. The engineering spaces were sprawling, labyrinthine, and dangerous even in calm waters, let alone as water began to pour in through the hull. For the stokers, trimmers, and engineers working below, life was already a punishing cycle of sweat and exhaustion. They worked 12-hour shifts, surrounded by heat that could blister skin and noise so intense it rattled bones. Yet, in those last hours, they faced a challenge that no training could have prepared them for. The new scan, compiled from over 700,000 high-resolution images, brought the lower decks into focus with an intimacy that would have been unimaginable even a decade ago. Forensic investigators found the metal grates in boiler room number 2 buckled inward, evidence that the heat and pressure did not drop, even as water breached the compartment. The only way this could have happened, experts say, is if the men on duty continued to stoke the fires and tend the boilers long after others had fled to higher decks. These men were the keepers of Titanic's life force, and their refusal to abandon their posts gave hundreds of people above them a fighting chance to survive. Think about what that meant in practical terms. Every extra minute the light stayed on, every moment the pumps continued fighting the relentless flow of icy Atlantic water, meant another lifeboat could be launched, another child could be handed to safety, another group of desperate passengers could make their way through the labyrinthine corridors to hope. Without those men, names now partially recovered through ship rosters and survivor tributes, much of the order on Titanic's decks would have collapsed into blind panic. One survivor, Lawrence Beasley, later wrote, "The lights, steady and reassuring, gave us courage. Only later did I realize that someone had to pay for that calm with their lives." The details emerging from the scan paint an almost cinematic portrait of the ship's last hour. The mangled stern section yielded a clue no previous expedition had ever spotted, a manual steam valve, locked in the open position, hidden among twisted pipes and collapsed walkways. In maritime engineering, that valve was a lifeline feeding steam from the boilers to the ship's dynamos, which powered the electrical system. Survivor after survivor remembered the electric bulbs burning against the black night, flickering but refusing to go out until the very end. In the past, skeptics dismissed this as poetic exaggeration. Now, metallurgical analysis shows it is the literal truth. The men in the engine rooms made a conscious choice to keep the generators running as long as possible, buying time not for themselves, but for strangers they would never meet. Forensic electrical engineers, poring over the three-dimensional model, found something else chilling: scorched wiring and corroded junction boxes near the forward power station. Unlike random fire damage, these marks showed a pattern of overload. The engineers had deliberately rerouted current through backup circuits, keeping the ship's power grid alive as long as they could. Some of these wires were fused by heat, evidence that someone took the time, even as water rose to their knees, to maintain the delicate balance of power and light. If the men had abandoned their posts even 15 minutes earlier, Titanic's decks would have been plunged into pitch-black chaos. This painstaking, quiet heroism stands in contrast to the panic and confusion above. Historians revisiting the official British and American inquiries into the disaster have found survivor testimony that now makes more sense. Women and children, rushing to lifeboats, recalled that the ship felt alive, even as it was dying. Many assumed that was just the memory of terror, but now it's clear, the sense of order, the last calm, was bought by the engineers, firemen, and trimmers who stayed behind, knowing there was no way out. Their names were seldom mentioned in the headlines, their stories often buried beneath tales of aristocrats and millionaires, but the 2025 scan is changing that narrative forever.